Before getting into the episode, I just wanted to let our listeners know that while all of the crew and our families and friends are safe, there aren't enough words to express the sadness that we all felt waking up to the sickening news about the tragedy on Bourbon Street on New Year's Day. Our hearts and minds are with the victims and their loved ones, as well as everyone impacted by these horrific acts of violence and terrorism. In the end, we're all a part of the same crew, and as a community, we can overcome these tragic events together. Here's what's going on with Japan Society New Orleans. Be sure to check the show notes for links and more information. Here we go. Crew of Japan will be hosting a live pod at Fan Expo New Orleans on Sunday, January 12th at 11 a.m. Come out and see the crew in person and be part of our first podcast live recording ever. Come out to NOLA Brewing and Pizza Company on January 15th at 6:30 p.m. for a family-friendly Japan Society New Orleans happy hour. Whether you're coming out for the food, the fun, or the drinks, we look forward to seeing you there. And also be on the lookout for announcements on other events, including a special screening at the National World War II Museum in February, our Quiet on Book Club online meetup in March, and a Japanese film screening at the Contemporary Arts Center on January 22nd. For more information and details about these events and future events, follow us on the website and social media. Everything will be linked out in the show notes. Hope to see you there. Hello, I'm Doug, and welcome to the Crew of Japan podcast, a weekly podcast where we take you on audio journeys through Japanese culture.
This time on Crew of Japan podcast.
Welcome back to our podcast for a special Mardi Gras bonus episode. Carnival season is about to consume the city of New Orleans over the next couple months. And while 2025 Mardi Gras is only just kicking off, I want to take a moment, or an episode really, to look back at a special connection Mardi Gras had to Japan in 2024. In early January 2024, the Crew of Rex officially unveiled its theme, the two worlds of Lafcadio Hearn, New Orleans and Japan. Back in the late 1800s, Lafcadio Hearn, a journalist and folklorist of Greek and Irish descent, spent about 12 years in New Orleans before eventually relocating to Japan, specifically Matsue City in Shimane Prefecture. He is one of the primary reasons that the sister city relationship between Matsue and New Orleans exists. So naturally, the Rex theme announcement elicited a special message from Akihito Uesada, the mayor of Matsue.
Hello New Orleans, and happy Mardi Gras. I'm Akihito Uesada, the mayor of Matsue, New Orleans' sister city in Japan. We here in Matsue wish this year's Mardi Gras celebration to be a grand and lively one. I have heard that the theme for this year's Rex floats will be the two worlds of Lafcadio Hearn, New Orleans and Japan. It is thanks to Lafcadio Hearn, a man that lived in both New Orleans and Matsue, that we can celebrate our sister city relationship. In fact, right now, I'm here in the Lafcadio Hearn Memorial Museum, where his life and works are exhibited. And next door is his farm residence. Hearn and his writing are not only famous here in Japan, but people from all over the world come to visit this museum and his farm residence. I'm filled with pride and excitement that this year, the 30th anniversary of New Orleans and Matsue's sister city relationship, the parade will feature floats with Hearn and Japan as their motifs. Those of us here in Matsue pray that this year's carnival will be a splendid one. New Orleans, please enjoy experiencing the two worlds. Laissez les ponts s'entourer.
Now, if you're unfamiliar with Mardi Gras tradition, you might be asking right now, what the heck is Crew of Rex and its importance? Or maybe you're just asking in general, what the heck is a crew? I mean, we are the crew of Japan, so I guess we should at some point explain what a crew is, right? And I think we actually had a thread at one point on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, but let me revisit just for those who are listening. A crew is a social organization that is mostly affiliated with Mardi Gras celebrations in New Orleans and around Louisiana. These groups typically host a parade and or elegant balls during carnival season. Originating in the 19th century, the word crew eventually became the de facto term for New Orleans carnival organizations. Now, the Crew of Rex, also known as Rex Organization or simply Rex, originated in 1872 and has held more parades in New Orleans than any other parading organization to date. Rex is called the King of Carnival. Literally, Rex is Latin for king. The Rex Parade rolls on Mardi Gras Day every year, and each year, one member of the organization is selected to be the monarch, Rex, for that year. But that individual's identity remains a secret until Lundi Gras. Once the parade runs its full route and concludes, the Rex Ball then begins, and is locally televised on WYES, the local PBS affiliate. Okay, now that we have some high-level understanding of the concept of crews and Rex out of the way, let's get back to the theme of 2024. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the theme was revealed to be the two worlds of Lafcadio Hearn, New Orleans and Japan. This, however, wasn't the first time Lafcadio Hearn and his works were picked to be the theme of a Rex parade. The first instance was in 1989, and it focused particularly on the New Orleans side of things. So why Hearn again? What exactly goes into determining a theme? Why did Rex choose to focus on the dichotomy between two of Hearn's most influential homes? To better help understand this thought process, here's a short excerpt from the 2024 Rex Ball broadcast, put together by New Orleans' public broadcasting affiliate, WYES. This broadcast features some insight from Rex archivist and historian Will French and Rex archivist and historian emeritus Dr. Stephen Hales, who help explain what exactly goes into this process.
Greek-born Lafcadio Hearn spent nearly a decade in New Orleans, writing for local and national publications. He spread the word about the uniqueness of the city, with its rich culture, including Carnival. The 2024 Rex Parade depicts some of the local life and lore that he spotlighted, before ultimately moving to Japan. Even though he had lived elsewhere, these two worlds meant much to him.
Hearn really defined what New Orleans is to the English-speaking world, yet many of our people have forgotten all about who he was. Now, he went on to Japan, to greatness, and is regarded over there as one of the great literary figures of all time.
Even though Hearn lost sight in one eye in a schoolyard skirmish, it never prevented him from chronicling what he experienced as an adult.
Some of the great stories that he wrote about, including bountiful pursuits of all of our great sportsmen's paradise wildlife, fish and game and things like that, to the festive, the cockroach who tries to commit suicide by drowning himself in various eatables and drinkables. So we've got the New Orleans part of the procession first, and then followed by the Japanese world of Lafcadio Hearn. And when he was in Japan, he wrote mainly about Japanese fairy tales and ghost stories and interesting things like that.
From 1878 to 1887, in addition to essays for newspapers, the author wrote La Cuisine Creole, considered one of New Orleans' earliest cookbooks, and Cheetah, A Memory of Last Island, concerning a devastating hurricane. The Louisiana Iris is a glimpse of the more serene natural beauty Hearn described in his writings.
If you look at the swamp lilies on the Night of All Saints float, I mean, they're incredibly beautiful and delicate, and they will shimmer and jiggle as the float goes down the street. The same thing on the Autumn Lover and Spring Lover float, the intricate wisteria flowers that will be dangling from the top.
For me, a beautiful float should be a beautiful piece of art, but it also should tell a beautiful story. And Japanese folklore is rich. One of the reasons Lafcadio Hearn went to Japan and fell in love with the place were the stories. And these floats tell beautiful stories.
Royal Artist builds the 20 themed floats. The numerous signature floats, the ones we see each year, complete the rolling tableau.
So we need as much time as possible. Right now, we've got themes set for 2025, 2026, and a potential theme for 2027. About 18 months before Carnival, we really get together with the artistic director and start talking about what are the concepts that we think would translate well into the floats.
Caroline Thomas succeeds longtime artistic director Henri Schindler. She follows a long line of women who have designed the Rex Parade over the years.
Wonderful women artists, most of them associated with Newcomb College. She enjoys finding the stories and then telling those stories in her sketches and these beautiful rolling works of art. Caroline is unique, though, among all the women who've worked on Rex projects over the years. Caroline is the only artistic director in our history that I'm aware of who both designs these floats, prepares the sketches, and then actually comes to the den and makes these things happen, picks up a brush and executes her own sketches and turns those into these beautiful floats.
For the full clip with corresponding video, check out the show notes to get the full experience. And once again, thank you to WYES for allowing us to use that clip in our episode. Now, in that clip, Dr. Stephen Hales mentioned royal artist, specifically artistic director Caroline Thomas, as the key player, the primary cog that goes into float design for Rex. And we were so fortunate to be able to catch Caroline during some of her downtime last spring to sit down and go into the artistic process of themes in general, float design, and turning ideas on paper into beautiful, rideable structures on wheels.
Today, I am joined with Caroline Thomas, who is a designer and artistic director at Royal Artists, who designs floats for many parades, but one of which is the Krewe of Rex, which we're talking about today. So Caroline, welcome to Krewe of Japan podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Before we kind of get into it, I know I just mentioned your role and what you do. Could you give a high-level explanation of what Royal Artists is and what they do and the role you play in Rex's Mardi Gras experience?
Sure. So for people that are not from New Orleans, you might not realize that all the parades are run by private clubs called crews. And they're the people who actually ride on the parade and they fund the parade. And I work for a production company called Royal Artists. So we get paid by the crew to make the floats every year. So every year it's all new floats. There's a set of floats at the beginning of the parade that are what we call signature floats, but the rest change every single year. There's 20 floats that change with the theme. My job is every year I work with the crew to come up with a theme and kind of space that out into 20 floats to be able to tell some type of story or some kind of concept. And then I start working on the designs. And then once I'm done with the designs, I'm kind of more hands-on in the warehouse, managing painters and kind of giving people feedback and just kind of keeping everything on task, along with Richard Valladay, who is the owner of Royal Artists. So we kind of tag team getting Rex over the finish line every year.
Before we talk more about that, I know in our chat ahead of our interview today, you had mentioned you actually had interest in Japan and studied Japanese. What was your connection to Japan?
Yeah, I became really fascinated in Japan probably in middle school. Probably like a lot of people that age, it was just access to movies and anime and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I ended up taking Japanese as my language in high school. And I was part of an exchange program between Baton Rouge and the city of Kanye, which is right outside of Nagoya, that was set up after the tragic death of Yoshi Hattori in the 90s. And he had been shot and killed, and it was a big controversy at the time. Yoshi's mother won a civil lawsuit in that case, and she used that money to create a sort of brotherhood between the two cities. So I was part of that. I stayed with a host family that had 4 kids, which in retrospect, I mean, super parents, like this tiny little apartment. And yeah, it was incredible. The host mother, her father lived in a Buddhist temple. He was a Buddhist priest, and the host mother's mother taught traditional Japanese dance and music. And then my host father came from this long lineage of calligraphy artists. And in fact, his father was the master of the local calligraphy guild. So they were just like steeped in all this incredible traditional culture. And in addition to staying with them, we would do these sort of brief trips into other parts of Japan with the other kids that were part of the program. So we went to Kyoto and Tokyo and Hiroshima and Miyajima and Osaka. And then we did like a camping trip in Gifu with some other kids. So yeah, we went all over, got really the red carpet rolled out for us. And just the amount of culture and the amount of hospitality and the amount of pride that Japanese have for their culture and how much they're eager to share it was just a real treat.
That's a hell of an experience for a student just to go in and really get that much, especially your host family. It seemed to be, you got to see all these things that maybe a lot of visitors dream of experiencing.
Yeah. And I got to go during some of the summer festivals. So they brought me to some of the Shinto temples that were preparing some of the kind of traditional altars and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it was a really great time to be there too.
That's awesome. So how excited were you to hear about this past year's Rex theme and its connection to Japan?
I was really excited, and I wasn't that familiar with Lafcadio Hearn's work prior. I mean, now in retrospect, I realize, I think his imprint on our culture and Japan's culture is evident. So now in retrospect, I'm like, oh yeah, I've encountered his work before, but I don't think I really realized it. It was a real treat just to read through all of these old fairy tales and ghost stories and even just his like travel logs of Japan at the time. And I was kind of prepared for Sometimes when you're reading people's writings, especially if it's their journals where they're kind of unedited from 100 years ago, that there's going to be some opinions that are not in line with our kind of modern thinking or a little, inappropriate. But honestly, he was so enchanted with Japanese culture and so open-minded and really thought that it was superior in every way from what he had been raised in. That all that enthusiasm just kind of pours out of his writing.
Yeah, that actually was going to be one of the things I wanted to ask you next, was whether or not you had heard or were aware of Lafcadio Hearn and his presence in New Orleans and Japan. And to be honest, I was in the same boat. Prior to the exchange that we did in 2019, the Sister City exchange, I wasn't really familiar with him either. And I had no idea what his impact and what his cultural bond he created with both places that he lived, New Orleans and Japan. And I had no idea, just something I wasn't aware of. And I feel like a lot of people are in the same situation. I feel like they experience a lot of what he had his fingers in his time in the New Orleans area and in Japan, but aren't aware of his presence. He kind of was one that's not really shown a lot of love.
Yeah, I'm hoping that some people after the parade went home and Googled his name and maybe ordered some books. So
yeah. How far in advance did you know about the theme? Was it as soon as the Rex parade ended from 2023 is when you found out soon after, or was it a little bit later on? Or
it was actually a little before 2023. So I think it was like fall of 22.
Okay.
Most parades I don't think are as far in advance as Rex, but Rex is one of those because it is like the big parade along with Zulu on Mardi Gras Day that they really see themselves as sort of like the public ambassadors of Carnival. So they usually have their themes lined up roughly about 3 or 4 years in advance. Like it'll be penciled in at least, and things might kind of shift around. So this had been in the works for a while before my time. So the artistic director before me was Henri Schindler, and he has had a deep love of Lafcadio Hearn for many years. And they actually did in the 1990s, they did a Lafcadio theme, but based on his time in New Orleans. So, and I think Henri felt like they never really did it justice, and he wanted to return to it. So I kind of see this as like the sequel.
Yeah, part 2.
Chapter of his life. Yeah.
You mentioned that you did some research, and that involved reading some of the source material and reading about his life. What other kind of research did you do in addition to that? Did you talk to other people that were familiar with his materials or scholars or anything like that?
Mostly just a lot of reading online and original sources as well. And then trying to also see how other people have interpreted his work creatively. So looking at the movie Quiet On, for example, and things like how other people found a way of bringing that into a visual space. Because that's also another challenge is you can read all this material, but then trying to pull out something that translates well into the kind of visual format of a float. Even though it's obviously about his work, it's also honoring Japan in a larger sense. And so I really wanted to try to make sure that I hit certain kind of cultural markers with that.
Yeah.
Things that are kind of sacred within that culture, especially within the realm of like fairy tales and folklore.
Right. I was about to say, like with folklore, those are some things that are deeply ingrained in traditional Japanese culture and history. And I was going to ask you, how important was it to you to accurately portray those images and those ideas and those stories when on display in these designs?
It's been an interesting discussion in general with Mardi Gras because we do tend to pull a lot from mythology and other cultures. And in a modern age where there is a conversation about cultural appropriation versus there are ways you can represent cultures in really respectful ways, but trying to make sure that, for me, if it is a culture that is outside of Western culture and it's something that's a living, breathing culture, it's not something ancient, you need to make sure that you are representing these people with honor and you're not glossing over things or kind of giving it the Disney treatment where you kind of just merge different parts of culture and don't take it seriously. It helps that I am still close with some of the people from that Japanese exchange many years ago. So I kept thinking like, this is going to get posted on Facebook. They're going to see all these images. Make sure that I'm making everyone I personally know proud of it and that I'm honoring it.
Awesome. So can you walk me through the process of what goes into designing a float for a parade? Like, do you pick a number of ideas out and then create a design for each, or is it more of a story you tell from start to finish?
It can depend on the theme. We've certainly done some that had a sort of chronological order to it. You're telling like a saga or something like that. For this, it was mostly kind of splitting it into 2 different stages of his life. So the first few floats are all based in New Orleans and his New Orleans writings. And that is the minority of the parade because, like I said, we've already did entirely New Orleans theme back in the 90s. So we didn't want to linger too heavily on it, but we wanted to kind of start it there. And actually, Richard had the clever suggestion of there's a signature float for Rex called the barge float. That's like this big boat. Mm-hmm. So we kind of had that placed between the two chapters. So it's kind of like implying a journey is happening. And then moving over to the Japanese floats.
Clever.
Yeah. And beyond that, it was mostly we wanted them to be kind of balanced. And that was a lot of times thinking about, especially with his Japanese work, Lafcadio Hearn has a big fondness for the macabre. And I definitely wanted to have a lot of those kind of spooky floats in there, but I also wanted to have some because this is a day parade that are more like playful and kind of more childlike. And then some that are just like focused more on like the natural beauty. And so I think it was more of just somewhat like making a mixtape or something, and you want to make sure that you kind of have everything kind of balanced out. And it seems to have a sort of pacing of sorts, I guess.
Okay. So when you're building out these floats, do you have kind of like a base float shape already out there, or do you have to draw it out and then someone builds it?
With New Orleans floats, we actually keep the kind of framework of the float the same every year. Okay. So they roll for the parade and then we pull them back in the dens and then we'll strip them of all of like the flowers and the kind of sculptural elements until they're just down to like the canvas and wood base. And then we will white out with a big heavy duty spray gun everything that was from the year before, which is very humbling the first time as a float painter that you witness that. And then you're kind of starting with this blank canvas. And so all the floats are kind of have their own type of shape to them. And you try as a designer to lean into it. So if it's got some big archway or it's got some kind of building on it and that kind of thing, and trying to find some way of kind of incorporating it into design. So like there's one that had a sort of structure on it that we made into the Kitsune float and kind of made it look like a Shinto temple and kind of playing off of some of the Japanese architecture, versus a float that might lend its well to something that's more like water themed and more organic. And then I just sat down with all of the kind of silhouettes of the floats and I start with just like really simple thumbnails just so I can kind of figure out what can kind of fit on where. And it's sort of like a big puzzle box at that stage. And then I still do everything old school. I draw it all out. A lot of designers these days are doing more things on the computer, but I like to kind of have that tactile experience. And so I'll sit and I'll draw it all out and kind of do a black and white sketch. And from that, we'll go to color where I'll do like a kind of mixed media using markers and gouache. And every step of the way, I'm getting approval from Richard Valladay, who's going to be the one actually building a lot of this stuff. So I want to make sure that it's something he knows his team can pull off and that's within budget, and then get everything approved by a few core members of Rex who are part of like the kind of design committee.
Okay. But
it's a pretty small group because, you get too many people involved in the kind of design approval and it'll gum up the system. It's like too many cooks in the kitchen.
I can imagine that would get very difficult if you're trying to get a bunch of sign-offs just to move forward in different phases of like design. And it just, like you said, holds things up along the way.
Right.
Yeah.
Because there's 20 floats we got to build every year. Right. So it's a lot of labor, but hopefully the results are appreciated.
Yeah. So when you see those floats rolling down St. Charles on Mardi Gras morning, your work's fully on display. What are you feeling as a designer and a director that had the full like reach of, what this is going to look like in your hands? And now here it is for everyone to see.
There's a lot of relief. There's some ruthless criticism. Like I can definitely be one of those that's like, oh no, you're always trying to learn from one year to another. So you're always like looking at the floats, trying to be like, what works, what doesn't. There's also just a lot of exhilaration. I mean, you spend all year working on this stuff. We work through the Louisiana summers with no air conditioning, just toiling away. And then it rolls for like this, like 3-hour period, depending on how many breakdowns we have. But, it's a general, like a 3-hour parade. And so it's like crazy to see. It's a wild way to make art,
Yeah.
But I think it's really important because you can see them in the den and they're beautiful to look at and you're proud of seeing them completed. But when they're on the streets, they become activated,
Right.
And they become something that I think in a lot of ways is sacred, I think, and I think the floats don't exist in isolation. They exist in tandem with the crowd. And it's this interaction and this pull and play that happens between the people on the float and the audience and the bands and the street parties and everything kind of interacting off each other. And, you feel like you're really participating in this really sacred tradition that's been going on. I mean, for Rex, they've been around for over 150 years. Mardi Gras is much, much older than that. And, you hope that you're kind of keeping this thing alive and strong and inspiring for next generation.
Yeah, well, you guys are doing a great job. I mean, the floats looked phenomenal this year. What was your favorite one that you designed?
I really like Hoichi the Earless, mostly because I do think it's one of Lafcadio's just like best stories. And again, his love of everything that's kind of eerie and spooky is really on display. And that's one of those that is showcased at Qui-Gon. And so I kind of wanted it to be a little subtle kind of tip of the hat to that movie as well, because I think that's a piece of art in its own way. So yeah, it's definitely one of my favorites. And I really like it's a simple one, but Japanese Garden, because just if you read Lafcadio Hearn's writing, he just waxes poetically about the insects and the flowers and the beauty of Japan in a way that I think really competes with like Thoreau writing about Walden. I mean, just his just love of nature comes out so much.
Yeah. Again, like I said, I think the floats look phenomenal. So congratulations on a wonderful job. And it's a shame that, like you said, they last until the end of the parade, and then you have to just tear them all down and undo all your hard work.
I know. But it's this thing where I think I love about Mardi Gras. It's like this living tradition. Like there's no real permanence to it. And yet it gets rebuilt every single year. And there's something about that I think that has somehow made it more resilient than a lot of other traditions in America.
Well, that's great. Well, Caroline, thank you so much for joining us. And I think our listeners are going to really enjoy hearing about this behind the scenes peek. People don't really know about, what goes into designing floats and how the concepts are created and everything like that. So I think you really shined a light on something that a lot of people don't hear about.
Yeah, I'm glad. Hope some people learn some things.
Yeah, thank you very much.
What fantastic insight from Caroline into all the things that go into float design. Check out our show notes for a full roster of the floats, including descriptions and designs in color. It's linked out in the show notes. As a frequent parade goer, you see a variety of floats that pass by with such elaborate designs and decorations. But while quick admiration passes through the mind upon viewing, I really wonder how many people take the time to think about the amount of hard work and creative juices that flow into the depth of the detail that is put into any particular float. And after hearing Caroline talk about the fleeting nature of float design and how as soon as the parade's over, they pretty much get torn right down, I will for sure be looking at Mardi Gras floats in a whole new light this upcoming carnival season. Being chosen for the Rex Parade theme, not just once, but twice, is proof enough that Lafcadio Hearn has left a lasting imprint on the city of New Orleans. Having lived in the Big Easy for just over a decade, Lafcadio developed an immense bond with the city through his craft and unique approach to cultural immersion. His love for the city and preservation of its culture still lives on to this very day. How? Here's a couple of examples courtesy of WYES chef John Folse and captain of the crew of Lafcadio, John Kelly.
In 1877, Hearn was sent to New Orleans to produce a series of stories on life in Louisiana, and he instantly fell in love with the city and its people.
And when he'd been in New Orleans for only a matter of months, he wrote a letter to a friend back in Ohio that contains a famous excerpt. The excerpt being, "Times are not good here. The city is crumbling into ashes. It has been buried under a lava flood of taxes and frauds and maladministrations, so that it has become only a study for archaeologists. But it is better to live here in sackcloth and ashes than to own the whole state of Ohio." Lafcadio Hearn, 1877.
During his 10 years in the Crescent City, Hearn wrote 2,000 articles, hundreds of book reviews, a novel based on a destructive hurricane, and countless vignettes on the beauty of New Orleans and its myriad problems. Hearn is also credited with being the first to call the world's attention to New Orleans' culinary culture. He even compiled one of the earliest cookbooks on local food called La Cuisine Creole. Renowned Louisiana chef John Folse, who chairs the Culinary Arts program at Nicholls State University, annually awards a prize known as the Lafcadio Hearn Award.
Because of people like Lafcadio, who really had such a great respect for the cuisine and culture of Louisiana, that today a 4-year culinary college in the state of Louisiana was founded because of the opportunity to preserve forever that cuisine and culture. He's still as important today as he was back then, if not more so.
There's even a Mardi Gras crew named for him. The crew of Lafcadio parades in the traditional mule-drawn style through the streets of the French Quarter every year, honoring as its monarchs culinary icons, throwing soup spoons to onlookers, and satirizing the city's maladministration, in Hearn's memory.
These are just two modern influences that we can easily see today. Both, to be honest, I had no real idea about until really this past year. But it's so incredible how both modern influences and connections to Hearn celebrate, support, and preserve the culinary culture of this area. Before that short clip, and again, shout out to WYES for letting us use it in this episode, I mentioned Hearn's bond with the city and how he developed this deep connection through his craft, particularly his writing. In fact, Hearn actually wrote about late 19th century Mardi Gras and his impressions. Here with me to discuss this and some other items regarding Hearn's connection to the city is Japan Society's resident Lafcadio Hearn expert, Matthew Smith. Hey, Matt, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
This is the third time, I think, being on the podcast, right? You did the Lafcadio interview back in the very beginning. Then you came in for the voiceover for the Tycho episode.
So this is time number 3.
Yep. So third time's a charm. There's a certain charm to New Orleans and late 1800s. You like how I did that right there.
Very nice segue.
So I know you've done some extensive studying on Hearn's works from all throughout his life. His parts in New Orleans, his parts in Japan. But while he was in New Orleans, did you ever find anything where he was reflecting a lot on Mardi Gras festivities of the time?
Yeah. So in February 1883, he writes this piece on New Orleans Mardi Gras for Harper's Magazine. And it comes out in Harper's with this massive 2-page set of illustrations, not by Hearn, but by the sketch artist J.O. Davidson. And it shows the crew of Rex arriving at the levee, the crew of Proteus coming down the street, the women dressed for the balls. But the funny thing about the article is that in some ways it says, look, the tourists are coming in for Mardi Gras. That's great. But you're not really going to see New Orleans when it's dressed in carnival garb, right? It's going to be in costume right now. The streets, the people are going to be masked with all of the sort of decorations for the festivities, which is funny that so much of the time in that article, New Orleans in carnival garb, is spent with Hearn saying, you're not going to see the real city if you come for Mardi Gras, which I feel like is something a lot of locals in New Orleans can sort of empathize with. That, we want to have friends and host them for Mardi Gras, but I often find myself telling my guests, well, you have to come back. Come back in October, come back in December, and you'll see the city, and it's kind of more, normal sort of form.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I've had friends that came down to visit, not so recent, back in college. I think after I did my study abroad, I had a few friends that came in town and we went to Mardi Gras and did all the big parades and everything like that. We did balls and everything. But it definitely is a different feel from the normal day-to-day of living in New Orleans. So you don't really get, there's just so much going on during Mardi Gras. You're back-to-back crowds everywhere, drinking all the time, beads everywhere. But, you don't really get to see the city because so much is cordoned off for you can't travel here because it's a parade route. Mm-hmm. Or you can't do this because we're closed for Mardi Gras. Different things. So you definitely need to... Anyone listening out there that wants to come to Mardi Gras in New Orleans, don't expect to find the authentic New Orleans experience during Mardi Gras.
Come twice. Do come, right? To anyone listening to this podcast, do come visit us for Mardi Gras. But come twice. Come for Mardi Gras and then also out of season. And the interesting thing with Lafcadio Hearn is that his reasoning behind framing the article this way is because he's so concerned for the very particular cultural mix that the city has, and he worries that gets lost with the influx of tourists coming into the town. I've even got a passage from that Harper's article. The romantic charm of the old city is not readily obtained at such a time. The curious cosmopolitan characteristics that offer themselves to artistic eyes in other seasons are lost in the afflux of American visitors, and true local color is fairly drowned out by the colors of Rex. And so I like that kind of play at the end there with color. He's like, well, the city's going to be full of the color of Carnival, but we might lose certain other local colors that would be present in other times of the year.
To be honest, even that sentiment carries over to today. I feel like there's I don't want to say tension amongst tourists and locals, but there's that conversation of the city, does it cater more towards tourists or does it care about the locals at all? And I feel like that conversation still to this day continues.
It's funny to see how many commonalities there are between contemporary Mardi Gras and 19th century Mardi Gras when you read these pieces by Hearn. He talks about the trash on the streets afterwards. I have a passage here from this. It's still from the Harper's article. Day dawns upon a scene of merry wreck. Streets are strewn with fragments of brightly colored paper, tatters of tinsel, remnants of torn decorations. Perhaps some gorgeous wagon or float disabled during the Great Review may be seen lying abandoned at some point of the route, like a gold-freighted galleon astrand. It's like, we might as well be talking about Mardi Gras from, the past couple years.
Tractor breakdown.
Yeah. But he is charmed by it. I feel like I might be overemphasizing his kind of critiques of elements of this, but he has a favorite parade viewing spot. He likes Royal and Canal for like that intersection, is what he mentions that being a good spot to view the parades. He goes to the Rex Ball and describes that in a different piece for the local newspaper. For the Daily City Item, he has a piece in February 1880 where he talks about attending the Rex Ball. But in typical Hearn fashion, he kind of frames it in this kind of spooky, creepy way that he's, looking at these people dressed up as, figures from throughout world history. And he says, oh, it's this haunted hall full of ghosts, right? And that those there who are just there to observe or who are not masking are like, spectators in this haunted palace.
Oh, interesting.
So he even finds a way, in his typical style to take something like the Rex Ball and turn it into a bit of a ghost story.
It's really cool how he emphasizes a lot of the culture and the customs of these festivals and stuff. But we just had a clip from WYES Play discussing things that he's really influenced. And he found charm in the city, but I think the city also heavily influenced him. And you could see that through some of his works, like some of the things that he's wrote for Harper. But also the clip we just played really emphasized the importance of a book called La Cuisine Creole. I mean, in New Orleans, I think that's probably what he's known for the most, right? Or not just in New Orleans, but in Louisiana.
I've got 3 copies of La Cuisine Creole because I think people think it's a good, fun Christmas gift for me as the Lafcadio Hearn guy. And I don't mind having a few. We've got one in the kitchen, one in the library, one for a while rode around in the back of my car with me, I guess in case I needed to make turtle soup on the go. And I'm glad to see it, circulating so much. I've tried cooking with it, every once in a while, but it's got all these fun little 19th century curiosities in it. One of my favorite recipes, there's one called, and he says crayfish instead of crawfish, but it's labeled crayfish broth for purifying the blood. So I don't know how much medical advice to take from Hearn if we're thinking of, crawfish is good for your cholesterol or your blood pressure. But in terms of why this is important to the city's culinary culture, this cookbook emerges at a time after the Civil War when writers like Lafcadio Hearn, like George Washington Cable, like Kate Chopin, are all writing this local color literature, this literature that's depicting the regional sort of features of Louisiana. And those are being published in major national magazines like Harper's, like Scribner's Monthly. And that's attracting a number of tourists down here to New Orleans and to South Louisiana. And so there's this opening for a kind of Louisiana culture to display itself for a national audience, a way of thinking through these people who are coming down as tourists, experiencing the Louisiana cuisine, and beginning to even build that out as a concept in their brain, the idea that there would be something like a local food cuisine in Louisiana. And so I think the popularity of the book, not just locally, but nationwide, comes from the fact that Hearn very much sees this project as presenting this Creole cuisine to a national audience. He says in the introduction to the cookbook that it's the only one in print containing dishes peculiar to La Cuisine Creole, which is not entirely true. There are other ones out there, but you got to market your product, right? But it's coming out in 1885, which is the year after New Orleans hosted the World Cotton Exposition, sort of this 19th century version of the World's Fair. So you have a lot of people who had visited the town for that exposition, wanting to take home with them a bit of Louisiana culture, Louisiana cuisine.
That's super interesting. And so do you think that book, La Cuisine Creole, is his biggest lasting legacy marker or tying him to New Orleans and Louisiana? Or does he have something another piece of work or maybe a collection of works that fly under the radar?
Like I said, I'm really glad to see that La Cuisine Creole is getting the love that it has. But the issue is that Hearn, as a prose stylist, as a writer, isn't super present in it. I mean, we see Hearn, the folklorist, for sure, like getting these recipes from these Creole housewives and these Creole cooks, bringing it into the cookbook. But it's a cookbook. It's sort of matter of fact. If there's a Hearn work about Louisiana that I would love to see like a revival of interest in, I think it would be his novella Cheetah. And Cheetah is set during and after the last island hurricane of 1856. There was this resort, and it's based on a real hurricane. The novel is, of course, fiction.
Sure.
But there was this set of barrier islands out at Ile Dernière where at the time they had a resort built up where, tourists could go, sort of a beach resort. And a hurricane hits in August of 1856 while guests are there on the island. And so Hearn dramatizes this in the text. But one of the interesting things about the depiction of the hurricane in Chita is that for almost the first 25% or so of the novella, Hearn doesn't really introduce any major human characters. We see like the hurricane as the plot, like looking at its impact as it comes in through the Gulf, comes in up through the marsh. And so I find it a super interesting text for a number of reasons, but one of them, that opener where he just sits with the dramatic and narrative possibilities of like, what if we just have the hurricane and the landscape be a kind of character in this opener and play out the drama of the hurricane there?
I think I've heard of Cheetah. I knew there was one about a hurricane. I know there's one about like a passage, I think, you wrote about a cockroach enjoying. Was that him or is that somebody else?
No, he's got a bunch of little, he's got a bunch of little sketches that he did for the newspapers. Some of them are only like a few paragraphs long because he's writing these little, sometimes comic, sometimes satirical takes on local life.
Got it. Yeah. So, it's good to know that La Cuisine Creole is not his only work that is important to the city. I mean, I feel like Cheetah, obviously he wasn't here for it, but was that something he just collected other people's stories who lived through those events and then wrote about it from there?
Yeah, I mean, I'd imagine he was looking at like newspaper magazine coverage of that. I mean, 1856 was way earlier than Hearn's time in the city, but there would have been plenty of resources for him to draw from to get those stories. Both like print resources and then also the oral sort of histories of people
right.
whose friends or family members may have died in that storm.
Right. Okay, well, there you have it, guys out there listening, guys and girls. Another option to look into if you're looking for Hearn's lasting legacy, on top of if you're looking for some Creole recipes, La Cuisine Creole. Those are both out there. But speaking of lasting legacies of Lafcadio Hearn, we actually had his great-grandson join me for an interview. Both he and his wife, Shoko, came to New Orleans to be here for the 2024 Mardi Gras festivities, in which they got to participate in some really incredible events, like the aforementioned Crew of Lafcadio, visiting the Rex Float Den, participating in the Lundi Gras celebrations near the river, viewing the parade from Gallier Hall Rex Box, and also attending the Rex Ball. Instead of me just rattling off these experiences, Bon Koizumi himself offered to come onto the podcast and share his thoughts on these once-in-a-lifetime experiences that he and his wife experienced last Mardi Gras. So let's roll into that interview. Today we have with me the great-grandson of Lafcadio Hearn, Bon Koizumi. So Bon, welcome back to the Crew of Japan podcast.
Hello everyone, my name is Bon Koizumi, the great-grandson of Lafcadio Hearn. I'm very happy to have an interview of the New Orleans Japan Society today.
And we were so excited to hear that you were coming to New Orleans for this Mardi Gras this past year. I know you had a great time. I talked to you a little bit already before this interview. So I'm very happy that you were able to join us today to talk about your experiences. The theme of this past year's Crew of Rex was the two worlds of Lafcadio Hearn. And for many New Orleanians and tourists maybe visiting New Orleans, this may have been the first time they've ever been exposed to Lafcadio Hearn, or Koizumi Yakumo is his Japanese name. So I want to ask you, what are 3 important facts that all people should know about Lafcadio Hearn?
First of all, I'd like to talk about some basic information. Lafcadio Hearn was born in Lafcadio, Greece in 1850 to an Irish father and a Greek mother. He grew up in Ireland and was educated in England and France before immigrating to the United States at age 19. He worked as a journalist in Cincinnati and New Orleans, and after staying in Martinique in the Caribbean, he came to Japan at the age of 39. While teaching English, he collected and explored Japanese folklore, which he published in travelogues. He is a writer, journalist, teacher, and traveler. Second, he spent about 10 years in New Orleans from 1877 to 1887. Here, he was fascinated by the Creole culture, a mixture of European and African origins and Native American culture. He explored Creole cuisine, proverbs, voodoo, and ghost stories, and published newspaper articles and writings. In particular, La Cuisine Creole, published in 1885, was the world's first Creole cookbook and is still read to this day. Hearn also encountered Japanese culture at the Expo in New Orleans from 1884 to 1885 and gradually became fascinated with Japanese culture. At the age of 40, Hearn lived in Matsue, a town in western Japan, and introduced its surrounding nature and culture in his book, Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan. That is why New Orleans and Matsue became sister cities 30 years ago, and the exchange continues to this day. Third, her thoughts and actions resonate with the modern way of thinking about SDGs. Hearn observed his subjects with an open mind. He paid the same respect not only to human beings, but also to small animals and plants. In other words, he believed that humans are part of the natural world. I believe this is why when you read Hearn's writing, you get a sense of connection between different worlds.
Hearn was a man of the world, all over the place in Europe, the United States, and then eventually into Japan, where he settled in. So it's just incredible. And I really didn't know too much about Hearn until 2019. And I still to this day, I'm learning more and more, and it's just really fascinating. So you got to see many representations of Hearn's life and work in the form of a Mardi Gras crew and the parade with his name, depictions of his work in Japanese folklore via those Mardi Gras floats, and also tributes to his life during the Rex Ball. How did it feel to see your great-grandfather and his long-lasting legacy honored in this way?
As a descendant of Lafcadio Hearn, I am very honored and happy that his legacy was honored at the 2024 Mardi Gras. Hearn is widely known in Japan, but I was very moved to learn that he was loved so much in New Orleans as well. We are deeply grateful to the Rex organization for choosing Hearn as the theme of the parade. I was also very moved to see the Rex floats, which feature many of Hearn's works, paraded in front of 1 million onlookers. I was surprised that Mayor Latoya Cantren introduced us by saying that we are guests from our sister city, Matsue. As a citizen of Matsue, I was most pleased. The mayor also presented my wife and I with the title of honorary citizens of the city of New Orleans. It was an incredible, joyous occasion.
That's great. I didn't know about the honorary citizen certificate that you guys received. That's so cool. I saw the schedule before you came, and it was really busy. You participated in the Krewe of Lafcadio parade. You had a private viewing of the Rex floats a couple days before the actual parade itself. You got to see some wonderful other parades that happened over that weekend, and then participated in other premier carnival events like Mardi Gras celebration and Rex Ball on Mardi Gras Day. Well, I'm sure everything was incredible, but what was your favorite part or most fun memory from the entire experience for you guys?
Everything was a valuable experience for us. At the Krewe of Lafcadio on the 10th, we were excited to be on the float and throw wooden spatulas. At Mardi Gras, I was nervous, excited, and delighted to be on stage at the Mississippi riverfront to greet the audience and enjoy the solidarity with the organizers. Seeing the Rex float up close on the 13th was unforgettable. It was a lifetime memory for us to see Hearn's works in a frenzy of excitement.
That's incredible. So what was something maybe that happened on the trip that you weren't expecting? There was a lot of things planned out with that itinerary, but was there something that you didn't know or did not expect to have occur during the trip?
One of the most memorable moments for us was being escorted by a police car to the Sheraton Hotel after we participated in the Krewe of Lafcadio parade. However, Canal Street was blocked off for the parade, and the street could not be crossed. We gave up on getting dressed and attended a restaurant dinner in our sushi chef costume. This was another unexpected and enjoyable event.
That's right. I remember you telling when I picked you guys up from the airport, I remember you were telling me that you were dressing up as sushi chefs for the Krewe of Lafcadio parade. That's so much fun. And to go to dinner dressed as a sushi chef too, I'm sure it was a surprise for everybody. So I have a couple more short questions for you, kind of fun ones. With New Orleans being a food city, I wanted to ask you what was your favorite meal from your trip in New Orleans?
For me, turtle soup and king cake served at Chef John Folse restaurant Revolution. The king cake, which can only be eaten during Mardi Gras.
I eat way too much king cake during Mardi Gras season. I love king cake. And
Uh,
by the end of Mardi Gras, I'm usually like very happy that it's no longer king cake season either. So I'm happy to wait one more year before I can eat it again. So I have a question. This one's not so much about New Orleans, but actually your opinion on one place. If everyone was going to visit Matsue, being that New Orleans is Matsue's sister city, is there one particular place that you think that every visitor should see in Matsue?
I, of course, recommended the Lafcadio Hearn Memorial Museum and the adjacent former residence of Hearn. The museum exhibits 150 articles read by Hearn and provides basic information about Hearn. The former residence is designated as a National Historic Site, and visitors can enjoy the beautiful Japanese garden that Hearn described in Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan. And now I'm a director of the Lafcadio Hearn Memorial Museum. Also be sure to visit Geshoji Temple, Buddhist temple, the graveyard of the Matsudaira family, the Lord of the Matsue domain, and watch the beautiful sunset over Lake Shinji.
I participated in the New Orleans Matsue Sister City Exchange program back in 2019. That was the first time I'd ever been to Matsue. And we did get to go to the Hearn residence and the museum. And it's absolutely fantastic to experience itself. And also Lake Shinji is, like you said, the view of sunset over it is just absolutely gorgeous. We were outside of it, or I think we were at an art museum, I believe, that's right on the lake too. And we got to see the sunset over the lake, and it's just a phenomenal view. You have to see it to believe it. So if people are interested, they're hearing about Hearn right now, and they're more interested in learning more about his works. Do you have any good recommendations on where somebody could start?
There are two. First is Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan, an excellent travelogue that uses all five senses to observe and depict the fascinating landscape and culture of the San-In region centered on Matsue. The second is Faidan. Everyone in Japan knows it as Hearn's masterpiece. Faidan means ghost story and is a literary masterpiece of retellings of the original story told to Hearn by his wife Setsu and adapted into English by Hearn. The book includes Yuki Onna, or the Snow Woman, Juroku Zakura, or Cherry Blossoms blooming on the January 16th, and the story of Miminashi Hoichi, or Hoichi the Earless.
And as far as I know, the biggest thing that a lot of people here are familiar with Hearn's work, it's his Creole cookbook, but then also Kwaidan. I think those are the two that everyone's familiar with, especially because there was a movie also made from Kwaidan and then the stories in there. It's very popular. Thank you so much for coming on today and joining us and sharing your experiences. I know that it must have been surreal for you to be able to come and see this honor of your great-grandfather here in New Orleans, during the big stage of Mardi Gras, on Mardi Gras Day especially. The floats were absolutely beautiful, and it sounds like you guys had a great time. So thank you again for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And please, whenever you can come back to New Orleans, let us know, and we'll happy to go get some king cake. Well, if it's during Mardi Gras season. If not that, then turtle soup.
Thank you very much. I deeply appreciate, again, Rex Organization and Japan Society of New Orleans for their warm welcome for us. I hope to see you again soon. Maybe please come back to Matsue.
And we will. We have a group coming this October, so you'll see some of us in Matsue this October. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
A big thank you to Bon Koizumi for coming on and sharing those stories with us. What a spectacular trip the Koizumis had. They really got the full-on Mardi Gras experience. Not to mention, I really wanted to try that turtle soup he talked about. It sounded really good. Like every Mardi Gras season, all them bon temps had done roulade, and the good things have to come to an end at some point. But the New Orleans, Japan Mardi Gras connection was only getting put on pause. As mentioned at the top of the podcast, Lafcadio Hearn is the primary bridge between New Orleans and Matsue, of which the foundation of the sister city relationship is built. While I'm not sure if it was intentional or not, the 2024 Rex Parade coincided with the 30th anniversary of the establishment of the sister city relationship. If you've been listening to this podcast for any period of time, you've probably heard us talk about the Matsue Sister City Exchange or relationship thousands of times, whether it's on our episode about traveling to Matsue in Season 4, or just the exchange program application adverts that aired during early Season 5. The Japan Society New Orleans Sister City Exchange program took place in collaboration with the city of Matsue during October 2024. During this trip, exchange participants got to partake in a wide variety of cultural events, allowing them to get an up-close and personal experience with Matsue. Among these activities was visiting Hearn's former residence in Matsue and the Hearn Memorial Museum, as Bon Koizumi mentioned in his interview, as well as second lining around Matsue Castle during the Matsue-hosted Little Mardi Gras Festival. Unfortunately, I was unable to participate in the exchange this year, damn it. But I did get to participate vicariously through Japan Society members and their social media posts. One of those participants was Matt Smith, who was on our podcast just a few seconds ago and is still hanging around. So, hey, Matt, you want to dive into the exchange a little bit?
Sure thing.
Awesome. But before we get into the exchange and the Matsue trip in general, I wanted to take a second just to ask if you had a chance to meet with Bon and Shoko Koizumi when they were here last year for Mardi Gras.
I did. Both Bon and Shoko had such a packed itinerary, and so much of it was being handled by the crew of Rex itself that I really only got to hang out with them really briefly one morning. Mike Turner, the fearless leader of the Japan Society of New Orleans, had invited me along the morning that he took Bon and Shoko to the Japanese garden in City Park's Botanical Gardens. I think it was the morning of Bacchus Sunday, but we just, the gardener opened the back gate for us. We kind of moved around the little garden, a quick drop by. But I got to say hi to them, see how they were holding up under the packed itinerary of Carnival season.
I'm glad you got to meet up with them. Did you partake in any of the Lafcadio-centric festivities? Did you go to the crew of Lafcadio or anything like that?
So I didn't make it to the crew of Lafcadio, but on Mardi Gras Day itself, I did, of course, go out to Rex to see the Lafcadio-themed crew of Rex parade, the Two Worlds of Lafcadio Hearn. And I actually masked that day as Lafcadio Hearn. So I had this big fake mustache on that some people took to be a real mustache. So I had on a yukata, too, since Hearn had a ton of affection for his yukata. I wore a yukata that day. And the funny thing was, I started off the day in the Marigny with some friends who do like the Society of St. Anne stuff, one of the sort of walking crews. And some of my friends had other friends in this group called Interrobang who make these elaborate, huge moving contraptions that go down the street. And they needed someone to pilot one of them that was like this big fish worm type creature where the mouth would open and people on the street could jump into the mouth and it would kind of gobble them up. They could run out the back. And so dressed as Lafcadio Hearn, I piloted a Mardi Gras float contraption from the Marigny into the quarter, made it down to Canal just in time to see the crew of Rex passing with its Lafcadio-themed floats.
That's awesome. So I have never heard of this. Was it Terra what?
Interrobang.
Interrobang.
Like the punctuation mark.
Okay.
If you go out to any of the like marching parades, the smaller ones that are able to go through the more narrow streets, they're the ones who make these elaborate sort of machine-like contraptions.
Interesting. Unfortunately, I don't go too deep into the French Quarter on Mardi Gras Day, so I don't get to see those too often. I see pictures and stuff, but it doesn't do it justice, I feel like. Especially the jumping into a fish's mouth and then coming out the back end.
Yeah, I was trying to find a way to explain it that would make sense. It's like there's the limits of language to convey what this thing actually was.
Right. So let me ask you a question. So your interest and passion, I think personally, was one of the primary reasons you were selected for the Matsue exchange program. How was your experience on the exchange? And did you get your fill of Lafcadio Hearn in the place that, to him, felt most like home?
Well, I don't think I'll ever get my fill of Matsue. I'm already thinking about when's the next time I'll go back to Matsue. But it is wild, to try to capture all of it, in a quick answer. I've been struggling with that over the holidays as people ask well, how was your trip to Matsue? And it's like, how to sum it all up in, a few words. I do want to offer a shout out to the Matsumoto family, who were my host family there, who are absolutely delightful. And Tomoko, my host mother, she herself is a bit of a Lafcadio Hearn figure. She does a ton of work collecting oral histories from elderly people who live and work in rural areas of Japan. And there was one morning on the exchange where, our really jam-packed schedule had a lull in it. And Tomoko and I just sat in her kitchen, drinking tea, and she showed me these recordings of her chatting with these old farmers and fishermen about their childhoods, their sense that these like rural local cultures in Japan were dying out and that these stories needed to be preserved. So there was something very lovely about this complementarity between her work and the work that Hearn was doing, collecting these stories of old Izumo.
That's awesome.
And then it was also great in terms of other Lafcadio Hearn connections to have Bon and Shoko Koizumi take us through the Lafcadio Hearn Museum, take us through the house where Lafcadio had moved with Koizumi Setsu after their marriage. So we got a private lecture and tour from the Koizumis. And you can tell they have a really spiritual connection to Hearn, or Koizumi Yakumo, his Japanese name, and his work. There's a sense that you get from talking to them, from hearing them talk about Hearn and his work, that they see like this importance of us taking on board and appreciating Hearn's sensitivity, his approach to the world, his concern for the marginalized or the kind of outsider figure, and to the kind of like aesthetic and ethical gentleness that Hearn brought to his approach with not just Japan, but with anywhere he was at. And so that was, I think, a very important part of the exchange for me too, was getting to spend time with the Koizumis, getting to spend time at the Hearn Museum as well.
Yeah, so can you elaborate just a little bit more, if you don't mind, just on Lafcadio's importance to that area, like from your reading and research, but also your personal lived experiences? What did you see that showed his importance, like his presence that still permeates through the Matsue and Izumo region?
So it's truly wild to see how much affection the whole region has for him. Not just Matsue, but the whole sort of extensive area around, that ancient Izumo region. You'll be in these little fishing villages. Like there's one day we went up to Mihonoseki, and there'll be a plaque there with like a passage from Hearn's writing in English commemorating like a visit that Hearn took to Mihonoseki. And, occasionally I'd have a Japanese person ask me, do you have this kind of thing for Hearn in New Orleans? And I had to sort of sheepishly admit that, like, no, not really, not to this extent. So yeah, the outpouring of affection they have for him was wonderful to see. I mean, there was one night the Matsumotos took me to this Suitoro Lantern Festival on the grounds of Matsue Castle. And so we come to this field and there's just all these paper lanterns scattered across the field. And they've all been designed. They've got drawings on the lanterns. Some of the school children and locals did the sort of artwork on the lanterns. And at first, especially because I see some from the school kids, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to see a lot of Pikachus and a lot of Shimane Nekos, the prefectural mascots. We should see a lot of Shimane Nekos on these. And then as I move through the field, I realize that there are tons and tons of them that are drawings of Lafcadio Hearn. Drawings of, not just Lafcadio Hearn, drawings of Setsu, his wife. And so there's a massive local appreciation of him. And I think a lot of that stems from their appreciation that he also understood the importance of Matsue and the larger Izumo area as this deep well of history, this deep well of Japanese heritage, a place deeply connected to the Shinto religion. And they always had, the funny thing is that that's not just a recent phenomenon. You'll go back and read Lafcadio Hearn's book, Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan, which is his first big Japanese book. It's published in 2 volumes. It's so big. And he talks about how he was received in that area when he first arrived. I mean, barely a few years on the ground there. He gets the invitation from the priest to come to Izumo Taisha. He was one of the first Westerners ever allowed into Izumo Taisha, one of the oldest and most important Shinto shrines in Japan. And so it was wild to, the Matsumotos took me there to see Izumo Taisha. Now obviously more open to Westerners, coming in, but to think, that he would have been one of the first offered that privilege.
I didn't realize that. And I mean, it makes sense. Was he a writer or was he an educator at that point?
No, he came over as a journalist and then the contract broke down.
Right,
so he came over with the idea that he'd be sending back pieces about Japan to the West. And he kept doing that. But his initial contract that he was on broke down shortly after he arrived. And Basil Hall Chamberlain, who is a fellow sort of Western Japanophile who was living there at the time, helped set him up with a teaching job or get him settled in. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of pride both then and now in the sense that this complete outsider figure like Hearn came to Matsue and saw in it the things that the locals also appreciated and saw in their community.
Just him in general, he's very observant and he takes the time to appreciate the details and the small things and the things that maybe others will just overlook in the day-to-day. In his writings in about New Orleans, he did that. And I mean, it carried over. It's his style, right? So it carried over to his work in Japan.
Yeah, it's the little things for him. One of his first pieces, My First Day in the Orient, about his arrival in Yokohama, he spends a ton of time talking about his rickshaw runner, the man like taking him in the rickshaw around the city. And in one of his last works, Japan, An Attempt at Interpretation, towards the very end, he also has this moment where he's thinking through like the rickshaw runners. And it's this sense of like these people who, may not be the most socially prominent or, culturally significant in these kind of grand scale type, contexts, but Hearn's interested in their stories and their lives and their day-to-day experiences as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned your busy schedule on the exchange and how you had very few lulls. One of those components of that itinerary that the New Orleans delegation participated in was Matsue's annual Little Mardi Gras Festival. I got to participate in this back in 2019. I've probably mentioned this a couple times already on the podcast, but this year's festival is a little different from the time I did. We went through the streets a little bit close to the station. This year, you guys got to parade around Matsue Castle, which is pretty incredible. So can you tell us a little bit about Little Mardi Gras?
Yeah, so we were on the grounds of Matsue Castle. We did like a little swing outside of the grounds for a bit, like our parade, we processed a little ways down the street and then back. But on the grounds of Matsue Castle, underneath this massive sort of stone wall in the little courtyard, there were bands. There was a sort of platform set up with bands from various local schools performing. And yeah, there's something bizarre about walking underneath this massive stone wall from this Edo period castle. And there are like high schoolers singing Hank Williams's Jambalaya, Crawfish Pie, Filet Gumbo. Or there, you'll be walking through and there's speakers blasting Al Johnson's Carnival Time. It feels like somebody just picked up the world and shook it and all the pieces got mixed up together. But yeah, they had a beer tent selling, what else but a Lafcadio Hearn beer. There's a brewery in Matsue that sells Hearn beer. And even the advertisements on the beer tent had these posters where the various monsters and ghosts from Kaidan were featured drinking Hearn beer. So it was a blast. We had a ceremony with the exchange participants and the mayor of Matsue. And the city of Matsue gave us these ceremonial gifts and certificates from the city. And when the mayor was, exchanging those with me, he indicated that he liked the Mardi Gras beads I was wearing. I brought some really nice ones that I caught at a parade here in town. They had like street signs for Canal Street and St. Charles Avenue. And at the bottom was like a crawfish and an alligator riding the streetcar. And so he'd mentioned that he liked them. So after the official ceremony, I made sure to slip over and gift them to him as a little return gift.
Oh, nice.
For all the hospitality they had offered us.
That's great, man. I mean, I can only imagine how amazing it was to do all that. I was having fun just watching and seeing all the pictures and the videos that you guys were posting on social media. We only did like a week. You guys had like 10 days, something
10
like
days.
that. You had a few extra days.
Mm-hmm.
So y'all had way more time to do more fun stuff than when we went over there. It was a little bit smaller of an exchange. But yeah, so before we wrap everything up, I wanted to ask you, do you have any Japan-related or Lafcadio-related projects that you're currently working on?
Yeah, so along with Sam Perez, who's a fellow board member of at JSNO and a fellow podcast guest.
Yep.
So with Samantha Perez, I'm working on an edited collection right now about foreigners who came to Japan from all over the place, from Korea, from Africa, from Portugal, from England, who were granted like quasi-samurai roles. Maybe not necessarily samurai in the formal sense, but these sort of samurai-adjacent positions, and how those figures served as cross-cultural communicators between the Japanese and the wider world. So, of course, Will Adams, who now I feel like everybody knows about because Hulu did their version of the novel Shogun.
Yeah.
Will Adams, Anjin, who will feature into it, as will Lafcadio Hearn, who is adopted into a former samurai family and takes on their family name. So I'm doing the chapter on Hearn along with the overall editing for the book. So we've signed the contract with Routledge and we're hoping to have it out within the next year or so.
Awesome. And Sam was on for our history episode last season when we did Foreign Born Samurai, Yasuke and William Adams. She spoke a little bit about that book. Matt's her partner in crime for that. Piecing everything together here. Piecing it all together. Well, Matt, it sounds like you had a blast on the exchange. Amazing experience. And I just want to thank you for coming on and lending your expertise to this episode about Hearn, but also sharing your experiences on the Matsue exchange.
Always happy to come on the podcast. And thank you for all the work that you do on this.
It's fun. It's a passion project. No, really, you help build like a full circle view of the love triangle that exists between Lafcadio Hearn, New Orleans, and Matsue. So, Matt, thanks again for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Doug. I had a good time.
And here we are. 2025 is here and a new carnival season is upon us. Year by year, Mardi Gras comes and goes, along with all the themes that are involved in every parade. But hopefully, this podcast was able to capture the hard work involved, the magic of the moment, the essence of culture, and the special New Orleans, Japan Mardi Gras connection that took place during 2024, all thanks to Lafcadio Hearn. We hope you're able to come out of this with a new appreciation for what goes into not only Carnival, but the shared bonds between the two worlds of Lafcadio Hearn. Before we wrap everything up, I just want to say some special thanks to everyone who helped make this special bonus episode happen. Thank you to the Rex organization, specifically Ben Dupuis and Will French, Caroline Thomas of Royal Artists, Bon Koizumi, Dominic Massa and the folks at WYES, Mayor Akihito Uesada of Matsue, as well as all the folks at Matsue City Hall, and Matthew Smith, our Japan Society New Orleans Lafcadio Hearn expert. This episode would be incomplete without all of your contributions and collaboration. If you want to learn more about Lafcadio Hearn or Matsue, we've got some great episodes waiting for you in the back catalog of this podcast, including a Hearn deep dive in Season 1 with guest host Matthew Smith and an interview with Bon and Shoku Koizumi. A Season 1 exploration into the Matsue Sister City relationship and the 2019 exchange with Dr. Samantha Perez. A Season 4 travel episode centering wholly on Matsue City and that region. And also coming down the pike in Season 6, we have an episode that will be focusing on the 2024 30th Anniversary Exchange Program featuring some of our participants. So feel free to check all that out, in addition to the rest of our back catalog, including, the Foreign Samurai episodes with Yasuke and Will Adams, where Dr. Samantha Perez also showed up on those. And we'll have those episodes linked out in the show notes, in addition to all the full-length clips from earlier in this episode. So feel free to check everything out. Did you enjoy learning about Lafcadio Hearn, the 2024 King of Carnival? Share with us on Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter X. You can just find us by searching Krewe of Japan, KREWEOFJAPAN. While you're there, give us a comment, follow, like, skeet, reskeet, share, whatever floats your boat. Let us know how you're enjoying the podcast. Or perhaps you like to share your feedback in a more private setting. Send us an email at krewofjapanpodcast@gmail.com. We'd really love to hear from you, especially if this is your first time listening to one of our episodes. Speaking of feedback, if you're enjoying what you're listening to right now, please take just a moment and leave a 5-star rating and/or review on your favorite podcast streaming app. Every single one of those 5-star ratings and reviews helps others interested in Japan and this kind of content find the podcast. Or hey, just, share this out on social media or let a friend know. I'm 100% sincere when I say that any and all support is incredibly appreciated. But that's it for today. Until next time, which should be Season 6. But until then, have a great carnival season. Laissez le bon temps rouler.